Additional funding is provided by the members of WHYY.
Ever since they showed up on the scene over a century ago, the railroads began changing American life. They were both the symbol and the substance of all that was modern in this society. Americans fell desperately in love with railroads. For some, it was the clickety-clack of rolling wheels on rails, the scream of steam whistles, the screech of brakes, and the sounds of hard-working engines that had captured their imagination. But for others, it was the big, fast trains and stories of the heroic engineers who ran them that had provided for a lifelong romance with railroads.
When I was really young, I think I was about 4 or 5 years old, my father used to take me around to see the trains and the train yards. And so once my father did that, it was kind of hard for me to stay away from the trains. I used to ride my bike up to the train station. One day, I went up to the front of the train to watch it go by. The guy hung out the window, the engineer, he hung out, looked down at me, he said, "Hey kid, you want to ride downtown?" I said, "Wow, yeah, you know." So I get my bike, I put it on there, I'm like, oh man, my mom's gonna freak out when she hears about this one, you know. So we rode downtown. I rode downtown with him, I stood up front, watched everything go by, and I was like, wow, this is great. And I was watching him run the train and all that. Got down to Suburban Station and he, "What's your telephone number?" I said, "Why do you want that?" He says, "I gotta call your mother and let her know where you are, right?" And she didn't really freak out, you know, because she knew one day that I was going to get on that train. So you know where I was from there on out. Bing, 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 bing. Wherever I could get a chance, I was out on that train, you know? I don't know. Some kids wanted to grow up and be doctors. Some kids wanted to fly planes, be firemen. Wanted to drive trains. Look at this. Here I am.
Today, trains crisscross the national landscape like lines of maturity on a weary face. But over a century ago, and here in Pennsylvania, the railroad was the strength of the nation. The Pennsylvania Railroad was a proud and grand network with more than 250,000 employees and 28,000 miles of track, enough to circle the globe. Without a doubt, the Pennsy was the leader among other railroads. And for almost 100 years, the Pennsy endured as one of the nation's most respected rail institutions.
And my father worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad from 1941 to 1963. I can remember my dad coming home after working on the steam engines and being covered with the coal dust, you know, and everything, and just be filthy, you know. But hey, it was a good job at that time and provided for a decent living for me and my brothers and mother. Well, I started with Conrail in 1976, and more or less was just, I wrote a letter to some people who had worked with my dad on the railroad, applying for any kind of position, and 25 years later, here I am. It's just, for me, a good job. Best decision I ever made in my life.
The Pennsy was thousands of experiences to almost 1 million railroaders. The end of the old Pennsy was the end of an American empire, deeply influencing both commerce and culture. From its humble start, it went on to become the nation's first billion-dollar corporation, and boldly proclaimed itself the standard railroad of the world. The year was 1893, and the U.S. was holding a party in Chicago, originally conceived to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. The Columbian Exposition was an international showcase of talent, energy, and industry. The celebration had its share of firsts. The world got its first glimpse of the Ferris wheel, along with its first taste of juicy fruit gum, Cracker Jacks, and diet soda. Spread out over 600 acres, the fair gave its 27 million visitors a chance to experience the latest cultural and technological developments the world had to offer.
It was a marketing ploy for all the nations of the world, including the United States, where different corporations could show their best and finest things off to the public. It was a great public relations gimmick where you could take the things that you thought were the most important from your operation or business and showcase them to the world.
The Pennsylvania Railroad, the self-proclaimed Standard Railroad of America, was there in all its glory to showcase its meteoric rise of the first 50 years. Inside its own pavilion, with hundreds of exhibits, fairgoers viewed the railroad's most advanced trains, along with photographs taken by William Rao, a prominent Philadelphia photographer who had taken pictures around the world by his 21st birthday.
William Rao had been hired by the railroad to go around and take photographs of the property, not so much to portray the locomotives and cars, but to show the scenery as a way of stimulating passenger traffic, vacation travel, travel for leisure.
They exhibited almost 100 of these views. With the amount of detail and depth and character in these photographs is truly remarkable. They have a wonderful kind of a purplish-brownish cast to them. And I'm sure that the people at the exposition who saw them would have been inspired to take some trips on the Pennsy.
The Pennsylvania Railroad's exhibit at the fair was an elaborate one, depicting a passenger station complete with railroad track, signal tower, and footbridge. The structure was a testament to how far the company had come in its struggle for a piece of the western expansion that was taking place in America.
Beginning of the 19th century, at that point there were three major seaports in the New World here, which was New York City, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The mood of the country at that point was to open up the West, open up the frontier. Immigrants were arriving at these seaports, and they was a land of opportunity. So the first move to open up the West was made by New York City by building the Erie Canal. Turned out to be very successful because once they got to the Great Lakes, they could go from one Great Lake to the next and move commerce and people at the same time.
The Erie Canal gave New York a real lead because it was easy to use. It wasn't technologically advanced, but there were no mountains across New York State. And so goods and people traveling from east to west could just easily get on the canal, ride the canal boats across the state and then down the Hudson River, and it was a very simple thing. Whereas to go from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh was an arduous trip across the mountains by hard wagon road.
So what the state finally authorized in 1828 was the building of the main line of the public works of the state of Pennsylvania. It was actually more of a multimodal system, part railway, part canal. Where they could not build the canal, they built a railway. The idea was, right now, taking the dirt road method from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh would take more than 3 weeks, going by Conestoga wagon or carriage. By introducing the railway canal system, it was proven you could do this in 3.5 to 4 days. So this was a great improvement in opening up the West and getting to Pittsburgh.
The main line of public works, the Pennsylvania Railroad's predecessor, was an amalgamation of several early railroads and canal systems throughout the state. One of those systems, the Allegheny Portage Railroad, had found a crude way to overcome a monumental obstacle, the Allegheny Mountains. The answer was an impressive yet dangerous engineering solution, a system of inclined planes to get rail cars and canal boats over the mountains.
At the top of each plane, there was a stationary engine where your car would be attached. So you would have to get out of the car basically by horse or walk up from one level to the next as your car would be moved up over from the first inclined plane to the second, to the third, to the fourth. It was very dangerous because they would try to stay on schedule depending on what the weather was. Occasionally the rope would break, the cars would fall down. It was a very dangerous operation.
Within 10 years, the unreliability of the horse-drawn system gave way to a technological leap known as the locomotive and took the railroad to its next level.
The technology was changing very rapidly. and the locomotive was introduced. So this was found to be a way to get around the deficiencies of the canal system and the railway system, the horse-drawn system. By 1844, the locomotive replaced the horse-drawn mode of transportation completely, and it turned out to be much more successful and can be used year-round.
2 years later, in 1846, the Pennsylvania Railroad was born as a means to ward off competing railroads that were now trying to expand into the state. Prominent Philadelphia businessman Samuel Merrick was elected the new railroad's first president, and engineering genius J. Edgar Thompson was named the railroad's chief engineer. Over the next few years, Thompson, a brilliant, secretive man, continually went up against the conservative railroad leadership. Thompson wanted to expand the railroad quickly by charging lower rates to attract business and by borrowing to finance rapid construction. His plan included abandoning the problematic inclined plane system.
They didn't want to do that because it would mean borrowing money. Thompson said, this is ridiculous, we need to finish the railroad. We're relying on the state, we're relying on this antiquated system of hoists and ropes and chains and things, and so we need to finish it. And so he took his case to the Philadelphia public via newspaper ads, and he really then won the presidency, election to the presidency of the railroad on that case.
Thompson became head of the railroad in 1852. In a master stroke, he found a way around the inclined plane system. Thompson devised one of America's greatest railroad engineering feats, known as horseshoe curve, a doubling back loop that overcame the mountain's gravity by a longer but gentler route. Horseshoe curve remains in use today with its original track alignment.
Horseshoe curve is an engineering landmark in the Allegheny Mountains. It's at the point where the railroad came west by way of river valleys and then suddenly hit a big barrier, the Allegheny Mountain, and they needed to get over that barrier on their way to Pittsburgh. Rather than go the old route of planes, which they actually did consider, they had the idea of just building a track that went a longer distance by going down one valley, turning and coming back the other, and that became Horseshoe Curve.
The railroad itself went to work here at the Horseshoe Curve in 1852 and finished in 1854. It took them 2 years with a crew of 450 Irishmen from counties Cork, Antrim, and Mayo. And these men lived here in shanty towns very close by, and they worked for 2 years round the clock, working very hard. They worked for 25 cents a day. They were offered meat at 3 meals a day, coming from famine-stricken Ireland, and for the hard times that they had endured previously, that was a pretty good deal. They used hand picks, shovels, black powder, wheelbarrows, mules and horses, and they would blast away a little bit at a time and haul it by hand into the fills. The work was backbreaking. They worked 12 hours a day. They worked in all conditions and all year round. As long as they were able to swing a pick and blow some more of the mountain away, they kept at it. They never let up.
Horseshoe Curve reduced the journey from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh from 4 days to 13 hours and became the gateway to the railroad's western expansion. The railroad was not yet 10 years old. While the leaders of the Pennsylvania Railroad were headquartered in Philadelphia, the building of Horseshoe Curve led to the creation of a new city, a central Pennsylvania town whose purpose was to serve the railroad. Altoona, Pennsylvania, became home not only to the company's new immigrant workers, but also its locomotives, machine shops, and world-famous testing laboratories.
Altoona was built by the railroad to service the locomotives, and within the first 10 years, from 1849 through the end of the 50s, it did primarily that, service locomotives, but in a short time after that, they began to make major repairs, and then design work came after that, and Altoona grew rapidly, and it served as the heart and soul of the Pennsylvania Railroad. While the headquarters were in Philadelphia, the heart and soul, a lot of the brain power as well through the testing department took place here in the city. The company went out of its way to buy the support, the loyalty of its workers. by providing for utilities, public utilities, building the hospital, the YMCA, providing cultural and sports recreational activities for the citizens. It did in Altoona what it did in no other city across its system, and it bought the loyalty of the employees, and they were loyal.
And the image of the people towards the railroad, that was the big daddy. That was the one that looked after the people, because the people that worked on the railroad, their wages were very good compared to others. But it was the spin-off from their wages that propelled the city.
The testing department for the Pennsylvania Railroad was regarded as the most scientifically advanced industrial research facility in the world. They tested absolutely everything. The bottom line was to put a penny in the pocket of the shareholder. You had to test it, you had to find the best solutions, you had to find improvements to make things more efficient. They tested things to the extremes. They tested oranges. They would, at that time, orange juice was served fresh every morning on the dining cars. They tested light bulbs. They were the third largest purchaser of light bulbs in the world, and so they would test them to determine what provided the best illumination, the most efficient light bulb, and the most cost-effective. They had a dynamometer. It was a treadmill for locomotives, and they would test the locomotives and run them full out, full tilt, to find the strengths and weaknesses of these pieces of equipment before they'd put them out on service, or once they'd been out and bring them back into test. The railroad always tested. They had an army of 400 to 500 scientists employed here in Altoona. They had 250 research assistants providing help to them. One of my favorite tests that they did, which was one of the most simple you could imagine, was in the shops. The men used brooms to clean every day, and they went through a lot of brooms. They put together a device where they tested the broom on a slab of cement, and they discovered that a broom bound in steel lasted 25 times longer than a broom bound in string. Obviously, that's the kind of broom they would buy. The railroad tested the gloves and the puncture holes. With the linemen were wearing those thick gloves, and if there was a hole, that lineman would be killed. And so they would put it in a saline solution, run 1,000 volts of electricity through it, and they were able to pick up where the holes were in the merchandise that they were buying.
Part of the testing was to determine what would be the bottom line, the best value for dollar when the railroad purchased. And the reason for this was because it was such a big railroad and such an important railroad that when it bought anything, it did it in huge quantities. So a difference of 1 cent on something that they bought hundreds of thousands of meant a real difference to the bottom line.
During the remainder of Thompson's presidency from 1865 to 1874, the Pennsylvania Railroad grew into the strongest railway in the country. It was a period of expansion and innovations. Coal replaced wood as fuel. Steel rails were introduced. And the Westinghouse air brake was developed, saving the lives of many trainmen in the process.
The original way of applying brakes on a train was that the brakeman would climb on top of the cars, and he'd work his way car to car, and there'd be several on the train depending on the length of the train, and they would actually turn the brake wheel, put the brakes on, and also release them in that same mechanical method.
Brakemen didn't have an exceptionally long lifespan because there were so many ways they could be killed in the course of their daily duties, by falling off cars, falling between cars, and it was a job that was the one job my father insisted that I not take.
When the air brake came, it allowed for an improved method, a safer method, and a more controlled method by the engineer on the train. He knew and could control exactly what was happening.
The automatic air brake gave the railroad's engineers the power to control their speed quickly and safely. Without that ability, the great signature locomotives of the Pennsylvania Railroad, from the graceful Broadway Limited to the powerful 180-ton freight locomotives, would never have been built. In 1874, the Pensie's great expansion came up against a nationwide depression. Little new track mileage was added, investments were sold off, and competition among railways became fierce. The railroad responded to the pressure with wage cuts, triggering many local strikes that culminated in a full-blown riot in Pittsburgh in July of 1877.
The Pennsylvania Railroad, along with several other railroads, decreed that all employees would take a 10% cut in their pay. And this was on top of a 10% cut that had been imposed a few years earlier. And apparently to the railroad workers, it was the last straw. They saw this omnipotent management squeezing the life out of them in order to preserve the dividends for the stockholders. And the rioting started in Pittsburgh and lasted for several days. Many railroad buildings were burned down, including the station, the passenger station. And it took the state militia and hundreds of police to finally bring it under control. It was one of the darkest days in the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad.
The rioters set fires that destroyed more than $2 million in property, including the station, yards, shops, and buildings housing 125 locomotives. 12 years later, in 1889, an even greater catastrophe struck in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. It was by far the most severe emergency the railroad ever had to face. A dam once owned by the railroad burst, killing 2,200 people in the devastation.
A dam burst above Johnstown, and a wall of water came down the valley and washed out the railroad. The debris that it washed down finally came to a stop against the PRR Stone Bridge in Johnstown. And it was a terrible scene because there were people who were caught up in this debris, and it caught fire, and people were roasted alive in this debris that was up against the PRR bridge. It literally scoured the town, took houses, buildings, people, animals with it, and created a terrible catastrophe.
The railroad was destroyed for 10 miles. One of its trains was carried 400 feet downstream, and 30 passengers drowned in the rushing waters. Tracks, bridges, buildings, all lost in the devastation, along with hundreds of freight and passenger cars and 34 locomotives. Railroad service was disrupted for weeks.
All aboard!
Fortunately for the railroad, elsewhere business was flourishing. A new generation of locomotives was introduced, and passenger cars were updated with steam heat and electric light. Stations were built in Chicago, Baltimore, Harrisburg, and Trenton. In Philadelphia, the railroad's hometown, where track congestion was a severe problem, the 10-year-old Broad Street Station was expanded with the largest single-span shed ever built.
Well, it was a beehive of activity. It was a Broad Street Station and the surrounding area. One of the other things that would happen in Broad Street Station, there were certain trains that would come in, and if they weren't on time exactly, the station master would be at the head end of the track, and he'd have his watch out. And if it was 8:20 and those wheels weren't stopped, he would start a stopwatch. And if it was over 30 seconds late, the engineer had to go to the office and report why he was 30 seconds late. And that's how the Pennsylvania Railroad thought about on-time performance.
Each fall, the bosses of the railroad would take a trip around the property on special trains, and they would look for the smoothest roadbed. How they determined this was to set a glass of water on a table in the dining car or in their business car, fill it up to the brim, and then start noting every time the water slopped over because of rough track. The track that had the fewest slops and therefore the smoothest rail, that track gang would be given a cash bonus.
Earlier, in 1899, Alexander Cassatt, the brother of artist Mary Cassatt, became president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. A sophisticated and wealthy man, he ushered in an era of cooperation for the railroad. Strong railways like the Pennsy and the New York Central joined forces to buy control of weaker systems. Most of the railroad's iron bridges were replaced with massive, graceful stone arches like Rockville Bridge near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. At almost 4,000 feet in length, it's the longest bridge of its kind. Cassatt was also the major force behind the creation of Philadelphia's legendary Main Line. an area synonymous with wealth and status. The Pennsylvania Railroad created the main line as a haven for railroad executives and their families.
Philadelphia was a factory city. But for the rich and famous of Philadelphia, they needed a place, their country houses, to live out in the suburbs. What Alexander Cassatt was doing was gentrifying the suburbs. This was country, farmland. He wanted to standardize everything. And the theme was, part of the gentrification was to make it look like Old England. And so he renamed all the villages along the way. Elm became Narberth, Jones Crossing, Libertyville became Wynwood, Athensville became Ardmore, Humphreysville became Bryn Mawr. They were given Welsh names. They wanted the area to look very Welsh, very English. So we see a lot of stonework around the area. You see these railroad stations made out of native stone. The churches, the schools, all the public buildings were all made out of stones to complement the mansions.
But Cassatt's ambition to make the Pennsylvania Railroad a national railway led to his greatest achievement. He envisioned trains from Boston to Washington and west to Chicago. For that, the railroad needed an anchor in New York City, and so he began the construction of the magnificent Pennsylvania Station.
For it to be a national railroad, it had to go north up into New York City and further north. And his engineers had told him it was impossible to get from the south into New York City. The tunneling through under the Hudson River was impossible. With his engineering background, he challenged that decision, sat down with the engineers, and basically worked with them and showed them how to do it. And that impossibility became a reality.
The job of tunneling under the Hudson River to bring the Pennsylvania Railroad into Manhattan took several years. In all, with the station that they built there, was a $112 million price tag. And the work was hard and long. The excavation that took place to make the tunnels required compressed air to keep water out, and this was dangerous because then the workers were susceptible to compressed air sickness, or the bends, as well.
The steel passenger car behind me, known as a P-70, was very important in the development of the Manhattan Transfer, which was the tunnel that ran underneath the Hudson and East Rivers into Penn Station in Manhattan, because in such a confining space, steam trains could not run wood coaches because of the inherent fire factor. So instead, newer, safer steel cars were utilized in that transportation run.
The Penske's new steel cars were an example of the modernization and refinement that was taking place on the railroad around the turn of the century.
The Pennsylvania Railroad switched from wood to steel cars in 1907. The problem with wooden cars was that because of the nature of wood, you couldn't build a very large car. They also caught fire when they overturned in an accident, and they had a tendency to telescope, which means that the car behind it usually entered into the car in front of it, killing most of the people in the car in front of it. The steel cars eliminated the burning problem for the most part and helped eliminate the telescoping problem.
Luxurious accommodations also were in place by this time, from the opulent parlor cars of the 1890s to the Pullman Company's spotless dining and sleeping cars, a tradition that lasted for decades.
There you had a porter at your beck and call. If you needed a drink of water at 2 in the morning, you woke him up and he got you a drink of water at 2 in the morning. If you needed your pillow fluffed or new blankets or anything, it was all taken care of for you.
You got the best of everything. Even the silverware and the dishes and everything on those dining cars was spotless, and their uniforms were spotless. You went in, they had tables there. No, you'd sit you down. They had linen tablecloths there. They had linen napkins there. They would come and pour you fresh water. Then the porters would come and take your order, and exactly the way you ordered is exactly the way you would get it, and it would be perfect.
We had VIP cars. They were something to see. The VIP cars, when they came in, that held your big Bahafs and what have you, they were like homes on wheels. They had kitchens in them, they had bathrooms in them, and they had bedrooms in them. And the inside of them were gorgeous. Some of them were really very beautiful.
To lure passengers to the railroad and the glamorous places it could take you were the photographs of William Rowell, a window into an enticing world that could be entered for the price of a railway ticket.
The Pennsylvania Railroad hired William Rowell to go around and showcase its property. The photos that William Rowell took were not train photos. They were photos that portrayed the railroad as the gateway to beautiful scenery. They showed the railroad as the means to get to a beautiful life.
Rowell's work was a large step in the use of photography as advertising, then a relatively new concept. Over a 3-year period, he created more than 400 photographs of Pennsylvania Railroad scenery throughout the northeastern United States. A well-respected photographer, then in his 30s, Rowell created pictures that were noted for their artistry.
Rowell's working method was really quite complicated. He had a lot of help from the railroad. They provided him a special photographic car with its own engine and tender, and it was kind of like a traveling hotel room and restaurant and dark room and studio all in one. But his equipment was heavy and cumbersome. He used this mammoth plate, large format camera. He had to get this camera on railroad sidings and down to the shores of rivers and up the sides of mountains, and sometimes they put it on top of the special railway car. There was a flat platform on top of the car. So there was quite a lot of physical labor involved, and of course the glass plates were heavy and fragile. So it was not an easy undertaking.
Ironically, although he was commissioned by the railroad company, few of Rowell's photographs actually depicted trains, deliberately focusing instead on the beauty of the destination. In 1914, World War I creates turmoil in much of the world and leads to unprecedented use of the American rail system. By 1916, the ever-expanding Pennsy proclaims itself the standard railroad of the world. But the next year, after the U.S. entered the war, the congestion and disarray prompt the federal government to step in. And even the mighty Pennsylvania Railroad is not exempt from the drastic measure.
During World War I, the federal government took over the American railroads. And it did this because they were not coordinated, and the federal government thought in order to, in the interest of national security, we need to control all of the railroads so that we can coordinate shipments. There were long backlogs of trains. Shipments weren't getting through, and so the federal government took them over to make things flow more easily, or so they thought. When the federal government took over the railroads, it also took over every part of their management, and it installed unions where there had not been unions before. After the federal government, after the World War I was over, and the federal government withdrew and returned the railroads to their private owners, the private owners threw out the unions. And so then there was the beginning of labor strife at that point, and that's what led to the 1922 shopman strike. The strike of 1922 was a national strike of shopmen, people who worked in railroad shops. Curiously, on the Pennsylvania Railroad, the shopmen did not go out in great numbers. In fact, in Altoona, where there were 14,000 people working in the shops there at any given time, they didn't go on strike. And the reason was that they were loyal to the railroad, and also that they feared for their jobs, because they knew that the Pennsy was iron-fisted, and they could close down the shops and build them somewhere else. Their jobs could just vanish and go away. So the Pennsylvania Railroad was a national leader in the resistance against the strike.
While no friend to organized labor, the railroad did set up its own company union and created a central personnel department, all in keeping with its image as the very model of a well-run company.
The Pennsylvania Railroad was considered to be the first modern business organization, and it got that way by creating a system of militaristic organization. It was a chain of command, and it was directly patterned on the military.
Well, the management program wasn't really that rough, other than it was, of course, dirty, and there was a little bit of hazing went with it to see if you could put up with it. Something like boot camp in the military, but it was an eye opener. Of course, everything was 6 days a week then.
If any employee would ruin a piece of material, or if they were caught doing practical jokes that was harmful to somebody, or if they would steal something, they were brought up on trial. And they were given different sentences. And sometimes it wasn't really a fair thing. I never really cared for trials because sometimes it was a personality deal. Maybe one person could do something and the other could do the same thing and they'd get different punishments. But they would bring them up on trial and we'd have to take their statements and then they could be suspended. Usually a general foreman was the one who held the trial. And then afterwards, the management decided what the punishment would be for the man. So sometimes it all depended if they liked the guy enough or if they didn't, or how they felt at the time. There was not really a set rule on it. So you never knew for sure what the punishment would be.
With the advent of the unions, safety issues began to be taken more seriously. But with the railroad characteristically keeping an eye on the bottom line.
The Pennsylvania Railroad prided itself on safety because any kind of wreck or accident meant that traffic would be tied up. They couldn't move trains, and of course that's the only way they can make money is moving trains. So anything that disrupted that was a problem to their profit-making ability.
There was a new safety rule every day, and the men had to know the safety rule each day. If they would come up to you sporadically and ask you, you were supposed to know the safety rule of the day. And it always started out the day with the safety rule at the safety meeting before the men started to work on their job. Safety was a big thing with the railroad. Of course, they didn't want them hurt, but because of the kind of work, it was difficult not to have injuries of some kind. Smashed fingers and toes were some of the biggest injuries, or eye injuries.
You could be penalized for violating a safety rule even if an accident had not happened. The safety rules were said to have all been written in blood, as they were all written as a result of an accident, and the rule was written to avoid a similar accident in the future.
The 1920s ushered in a time of post-war prosperity for the country, and the Pennsylvania Railroad was in its heyday. It continued its dominance by entering the Detroit market, its last significant route, to claim the business of the Ford Motor Company's plants, and gross earnings peaked at $750 million.
The golden age of railroad travel meant different things to different people. To the passengers, it was probably pretty much a golden age. You could travel almost anywhere by train. Certainly the Pennsylvania Railroad, with 26,000 miles of track, could take people a lot of different places. To the people who worked on the railroad, it was a mixed experience. For some it was a good living, for some it was a hard living. But during that time, it was, in the public eye, it was a golden time.
Trains like the prestigious and pricey Broadway Limited exemplified the golden era.
The Broadway Limited from the Pennsylvania Railroad was the really show train of the railroad. It was where they put the newest cars, the newest coaches, the newest china, the newest silver. They had their best employees run the train because it's where the people who had the money went, from New York to Chicago and back.
But by the middle of the decade, automobiles and trucks were beginning to cut into the railroad's profits, and the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed were monumental blows. Earnings were cut in half. Stock fell from $110 to $6 a share, and 75,000 employees were let go. To fight the erosion, the railroad stepped up its efforts in the use of electric power to replace steam within the system. By 1933, electric locomotives were carrying passengers from New York to Philadelphia, and the following year, the cream of the crop, the famous GG1, was introduced.
The locomotive that we're seeing here is locomotive number 4935, is a GG1 class locomotive. It is arguably probably the most successful electric locomotive ever designed on an American railroad. The whole idea behind electric service was that it was cleaner, more efficient, and it permitted a more direct passenger service than was previously provided under the dirty, black, smoke-belching locomotives that hauled PRR passenger trains. The GG1 also cut the time that it took to run passenger trains almost by half.
By 1938, electric locomotives ruled the rail lines east of Harrisburg, while a new fleet of steam engines was built to carry passengers to the west. But the days of steam were dwindling, cut even shorter by the railroad's next innovation, the use of diesel fuel.
Dieselization was first introduced on the Pennsylvania Railroad in the mid-1940s because it was a much more efficient, cheaper, more economical way to run a train. Steam locomotives were very labor-intensive. They required hundreds of men and man-hours to maintain. They were dirty, they were black, they were gritty. They had a significant cost factor to maintain. The reason the Pennsylvania Railroad had both electric and diesel was that the Pennsylvania Railroad found it a lot cheaper to operate diesel locomotives because they could be taken anywhere on the system, whereas with electric locomotives, they required an entire physical plant. With a diesel locomotive, with the turn the key, they could turn right over. Whereas with steam locomotives, it took them several hours to bring the engine up from a cold steel up to full pressure.
When they went to diesel, that's when it started to clean up. We started to clean the shops up. We painted the floors, we painted the lines. Everything was really done. You could walk in there in the morning in a white shirt and be clean, and you could walk out with that white shirt on in the morning and in the afternoon. So it made a big difference. With steam, you could never do that. No way.
When the diesel came into being, naturally it was beneficial to the bottom line for the railroad, which in turn meant fewer employees. And it was basically the demise of the railroad employment in our area.
The advent of World War II brought about more employee changes. All across America, women were entering the workforce in unprecedented number to replace the men fighting overseas. The Pennsylvania Railroad was no exception.
They came in and worked as switch people in the yards. They worked as brakemen on the trains. They worked collecting tickets. Of course, they sold tickets in the ticket offices, but they also went to work in the shops. They were crane operators and mechanics as well.
They needed somebody to fill these jobs, so they decided that women were needed, so they advertised for them, and that's how we found they ended up on the railroad. We got a job, and then, as I say, we carried T behind our name as temporary employees, but I carried that till the day I left after 26 years.
The reason a lot of the men resented the women was simply because they felt men were the breadwinners of the families, and that particularly if a woman was married, that she was taking a job away from the men. But that really wasn't the case all the time, because a lot of the women were widows or divorced or even single, and they themselves were breadwinners.
The Second World War was one of the Pennsylvania Railroad's finest hours. Wartime restrictions on cars and gasoline rationing sent the nation back to the railroad in record numbers. Troops and supplies had to be moved across the country, and the Pennsylvania Railroad rose to the challenge. Ironically, its monumental efforts severely hurt the railroad.
World War II was considered to be the Pensie's last great stand by some, because it was, as the nation's largest railroad, the one on whom the job of moving materiel and troops fell the hardest. And so it was an incredible conveyor belt of machinery, of tanks, of weaponry, and of soldiers like no other railroad in America. The military moved so many trains over the Pennsylvania that it really became worn out as a result of carrying all the wartime material.
After World War II, the federal government was not interested in investing money in railroads. It was more interested in the interstate highway system. It was more interested in airports and air travel, because that's where it felt it needed to put its money.
In characteristic fashion, the railroad fought back, spending more than $1 billion in plant and equipment improvements in the post-war years, but steam locomotives were increasingly viewed by management as unaffordable dinosaurs, and more than half were scrapped by 1953.
Yeah, during the 1950s, I noticed that there were certain things that weren't being done as normal. Locomotives were not going to the engine house as frequently as they used to. Track gangs were not as big as they used to be, and replacing rail and ties did not seem to be progressing at the old fashion.
The morale at that time did seem to go down a little bit. They just weren't quite as cheerful going to work as they had been. And the ones that had to be furloughed had to leave town and go take another job till they could come back to go to work again. Some fellows that I know had furloughed, gone to take another job, never did come back to railroading.
Still, to the outside world, the railroad kept up appearances. Even though ridership was falling and many trains were being discontinued, the company closed out 1954 as the fifth largest corporation in the country. But the recession of 1957 hit hard. Revenues and ridership continued to plunge. Long-distance passenger service was all but abandoned, and the fires of the steam locomotives were extinguished for good. By 1968, the railroad looked to its competition for a solution, a short-lived one, the creation of the Penn Central Railroad.
By 1968, Pennsy was in such trouble that it was forced to really marry its old rival, the New York Central. The merger was a disaster. They had thought that they could save money by combining and trimming, but the result was that they had such dissimilar cultures. Their officers didn't get along, their computers didn't talk to each other, and it really took only about 2.5 years for them to go bankrupt.
As a third-generation railroader of PRR from both sides of my family, of course, the merger was a disappointment to me, I think, and a little discouraging, but we had hopes. But when the bankruptcy came along and when we saw that the collapse of the railroad was, as we knew it, was inevitable, it was a major, it had a major effect on a lot of people, and I'm among them.
Lost a lot of money. I had a lot of stock in the railroad. I lost it all. I kept that for my retirement, and I just lost every penny I had in there. Some of that stock I was paying $80 a share for, and it really upset me, I'll tell you. But hey, that's the way life goes. You forget it.
I saw so many fellows lose out on their work and didn't know what was coming up next. And it just felt so bad thinking about their families, and some of the fellows had children in school and colleges. And it was a devastating area for them.
The Pennsy was the first billion-dollar corporation in America, but then in the 60s, when it came to ruin, it was the largest bankruptcy in Wall Street history.
On June 21st, 1970, with losses of more than $800,000 a day, the Penn Central Railroad officially filed for bankruptcy. The next year, the U.S. government stepped in again and created Amtrak to relieve the Penn Central of most of its passenger service. Still, the downward spiral continued, and in 1976, Conrail was established to take over the salvageable remains of the Penn Central and other bankrupt railroads. There is more than just its spirit left behind the historic, unparalleled, grandly ambitious Pennsylvania Railroad. What remains is a rich legacy, an ongoing reminder of the glory days of the old Pennsy.
At its height, the Pennsylvania Railroad employed 280,000 people, had 26,000 miles of track, and ran 5,000 trains a day.
Both my grandfathers worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. My father, my brother, 4 or 5 uncles. And if you lived in Altoona all your life, the city was created because of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the shops. And I had a good life here in Altoona. And I raised 5 children. I had a payday every week. My father had a payday. I loved the Pennsylvania Railroad.
My father was a pipe fitter, and when he retired, he was a pipe fitter inspector, and he had 49 years service when he retired. And the railroad gave us a good life. We had enough to eat and a place to home to live in and all those things that we may not have had otherwise. And I lived the railroad life all my life through my parents and through me working in the railroad. To me, the Pennsylvania Railroad was the greatest that there was. I think it was because they were very businesslike. You had to do your job, and the pay was good, and it was a good opportunity. And it has always held a place in my heart with the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the passing of it just seemed like something of history that is gone.
You could get your shoes shined, or you could get your hair done, or anything on a train, you know, before. But now that all that is past, you know, everything is hurry, 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 and a lot of it has lost its, I don't know, I guess you call it finesse or something, but it's sure different today.
Well, the Pennsylvania Railroad had a lot of development in this country because it's become the largest railroad in the United States, and it's the largest railroad in the world at one time. And they took care of practically the whole East Coast, and they went clear into St. Louis, Missouri. And the other railroads weren't near as big as the Pennsylvania Railroad. And we known that the Pennsylvania Railroad not only hauled coal, oil, wood, and passenger service, they held everything.
A lot of people I know ask the conductor, you know, when are we coming up to the Horseshoe Curve? Still very much big interest in that. It's always nice to look around there and see the rest of your train. It's quite an accomplishment the way it was built with picks and shovels. It's just hard to imagine.
The Pennsylvania Railroad started out as a relatively small operation in its beginning, but before it ended, it turned into the most famous and most known railroad in the world. And I was proud to be a very small part of that.
But while Amtrak and other rail lines now travel tracks that were first laid by the old Pensy, the spirit of the fallen giant survives in people like John Gill, a second-generation trainsman.
Traveling by train, you get to meet a lot of different people. That's an experience in itself. People from all over. You get to see the countryside, whereas an airplane you don't get to see too much. I'm my own boss, more or less. I get a sense of accomplishment, getting people from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh safely. A lot of people think it's all done by computer, or you just put it on cruise control and away you go, but however, that's not true at all. I time myself how many seconds or minutes go by without me actually doing anything, and I think the longest break I got was 40 seconds.
Zachary Collins from a new generation of railroaders.
My main route is the Northeast Corridor between New York and Washington. At one point, the Pennsylvania Railroad owned that piece of railroad. Today, it's almost exactly the same as it was. The Northeast Corridor is the fastest piece of railroad that we have in the United States. I don't think a lot of things would be here without the Pennsylvania Railroad. Well, a lot of guys that work for the Pensy taught me everything I know out here on Amtrak. Those guys tell me how cold they were in the winter and how hot they were in the summer. But they'll always come back and say they pulled the hell out of a train. They all enjoyed running them. What I like about being an engineer is the fact that I'm in control of the train and I'm part of getting people from point A to point B. Sometimes it may be a 3-car train, sometimes it's a 12-car train with 800-900 people on it. When I was a kid, I never thought I'd ever be up here doing this. I always thought it would fade and go to the wayside and I could get it out of my blood, but it never left. And I tried and tried and tried until I got a job, and I didn't get a job. But hey, I actually doing what I want to do.
Though the Pensy lost its own battle to survive in 1968, the Pennsylvania Railroad legacies live on in today's modern railroad scene.
Railroad was made possible by a grant from the Pennsylvania Public Television Network. The network receives funding from the Commonwealth to provide public television for all Pennsylvanians. Additional funding was provided by the members of WHYY.